Hello, students. This is Professor Gore, and this is the last part of the European Settlement North America recorded lecture. And in this topic, I'm going to be covering another big topic, kind of like the Chesapeake colonies of Virginia and Maryland were. I'm going to be covering New England, and we're going to be talking about the Puritans, which were a much larger group, and then the Pilgrims, who are separatists, who are a much smaller group. And so let me kind of give you some background. The the Church of England had broken away with Henry VIII from the Catholic Church, mainly for selfish reasons, because Henry VIII was wanting to annul his marriage, and the Pope wouldn't do it because he already annulled another marriage because he wanted a male heir to the throne. And so the Church of England was created, and the Puritans were those within the Church of England that were Calvinist. And the Calvinists believe that God has predestined some to go to heaven to show his imminent mercy. And unfortunately, God has predestined some to go to hell to show that he is a just God. And so they had a problem with some of the practices of the Anglican Church. They didn't believe that people should be worshiping in the pews who were not part of the elect and were not believers and so forth. But the Puritans, they kind of get a bad rap for that. But there's some really positive things about the Puritans. They had incredible work ethic. In fact, some of that hardworking American ethic kind of comes from the Puritans. Also, they had a tremendous desire for everybody to be able to read. And so literacy is one of their lasting legacies in American history, because everybody in the Puritan faith could read and write, where you had like 97% of the world's population was illiterate. And the Puritans, everywhere they went, established schools, and that's going to be a lasting legacy in American history as well. The Pilgrims, on the other hand, were separatists. The Puritans thought that they could purify the Church of England and hadn't given up on it. The Pilgrims, on the other hand, were like, no, we're done with them. We're going to completely separate from the Church of England. And they eventually get fed up and they move to Holland or the Netherlands. But then as they begin raising their children, they notice they're kind of raised up in this Dutch culture, and they want their own. They want them to raise them up in English culture. And so the Pilgrims end up getting a land grant from, with a joint stock company situation, from the King of England, and they travel to, they were actually supposed to go to Virginia, but there's a couple different theories. One is that they were blown off course and ended up in Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts. The other theory is, and probably the one that I tend to go with, but certainly don't take my word for it, in this particular case, because nobody really knows, is they had heard that there had been a outbreak of illness, such as smallpox or some other kind of pandemic, along the coast of Massachusetts among Native Americans, and they thought it would be easier for them to settle there, and that's why they went there. So who knows? Both are certainly reasonable explanations for why they ended up in Massachusetts or in Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts. So who are these Puritans? So I've kind of covered that briefly, but they wanted to preserve what they viewed as this pure Christian faith. They also wanted to be able to, everybody to be able to own land in the community. So what better place to do that than go to Massachusetts, where they could, in theory, claim land. Of course, they're going to push around some Native Americans off their land to be able to gain that. And so they established a holy commonwealth in America. They helped to reform the Church of England within America. And so they referred to their moving out as this errand in a wilderness. And they hoped to kind of create this shining light example, this city upon a hill that would kind of show this kind of really awesome society. The Church of England would be like, whoa, we want to be like that. Let's reform the Church of England and make our society like that. It was a pie in the sky dream that didn't come to reality, but the Puritans did, in their minds, try to create a very righteous society. And so New England colonies differ from the other European colonies in America because they were moving there for religious reasons. Now, later Maryland does that for Catholic sanctuary and so forth. But the thing is they moved in large families, and they didn't just move. Man, they rolled in with like 1,000 settlers deep, and they had all kinds of occupations, which is why they were able to take off and be much more successful than those in the Chesapeake were initially. Now, they don't have big cash crop farming like tobacco, but what they are going to have is a variety of ways to make a living. They're going to be shipbuilders. They're going to be farmers. They did farm a lot of food crops, just not the big cash crop farming. They also made hemp for rope. They also would buy sugar from the Caribbean and turn it into molasses and so forth, which was kind of like a syrup thing. It's different from maple syrup, but it's a similar kind of consistency there. Just a little bit, I would say, stickier than even maple syrup. And they had other occupations from blacksmiths and tradesmen and merchants and so forth. Okay. And so they were very pious Protestants, which means they try to live a very righteous lifestyle, and they were very moral. You can't deny that. Of course, when we get to Salem witch trials, we're going to see some of that problems there. They immigrated as very large families. That's a key difference between them and the Chesapeake. Okay, there was a few families that immigrated with the Chesapeake, but the vast majority were single men. These people migrated as families. That is a key difference between the Puritans or the New England colonies, because the Pilgrims migrated as families as well, and the Chesapeake. They were also typically middle class, where a lot of the indentured servants that came to Chesapeake weren't. Okay, they were lower class. And with the climate being colder, disease was not as bad as it was in the Chesapeake. Also, New Englanders lived longer and were healthier. That's a key difference between them and the Chesapeake colonies as well. They also were around 100,000 Native Americans living in New England at this time. One commonality they're going to have, they both had conflict with Native Americans. Okay. Let's look at the Pilgrims specifically. They come first and later the Puritans. So the Pilgrims who settled in Plymouth were religious separatists. Okay, they had left the Church of England, and they had the Puritans were getting persecuted by the king, and one of the reasons why the Puritans ended up coming. And they lived among the Dutch Calvinists in Holland. Subsequently, 35 of those exiles resolved to migrate to America to maintain their English identity. Led by William Bradford and joined by 67 migrants from England, they sailed in America in 1620 aboard the ship called the Mayflower. My mom's mother's descendants or ancestors came on the Mayflower. Sorry, my voice is kind of not doing too well tonight. They also settled near Cape Cod in southeastern Massachusetts. My parents have been there recently. It's a beautiful place. They lacked a royal charter. They created their own government and had a covenant of government called the Mayflower Compact, which is they agreed basically to form a government. It's not actually their government document like the Constitution. And but some people consider it the first Constitution of America. I really consider it the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. But anyway, the Pilgrims used the Puritan self-governing religious congregation as a model for its political structure. The first winter in Plymouth tested the Pilgrims. It was similar to the first winter for Jamestown, except there were more men and women there. Like the early settlers of Virginia, the Pilgrims faced hunger and disease. Of the 102 migrants who arrived in November, only half survived until spring. But then Plymouth became a healthy and thriving community. The cold climate inhibited the spread of mosquito-borne diseases, and the Pilgrims' religious discipline established a strong work ethic. Moreover, because a smallpox endemic in 1618 had killed most of the local Wampanoag people, the migrants faced few external threats, unlike the people in the Chesapeake. The Pilgrims built solid houses and planted ample crops, and their number grew rapidly. They had high birth rates. The Puritans believed in having lots and lots of kids. So did the Pilgrims. Man, they were breeding like nobody's business. They had the average Puritan woman had 8 to 10 pregnancies. They raised 6 to 8 kids to adulthood. That's crazy. By 1640, there were 3,000 settlers in Plymouth. To ensure political stability, they issued a written legal code that provided for representative self-government, broad political rights, and religious freedom of conscience. In 1629, King Charles dissolved Parliament, and the head of the Church of England dismissed hundreds of Puritan ministers. And this led to the thousands of Puritans coming to the Americas. Okay. Now, a Native American Squanto did help the Pilgrims where they had their first Thanksgiving, which we recognize today. Squanto had learned European languages from trading with them on the coast. Very smart man. Okay. Now, the Congregationalists is what they refer to themselves. Those that were on the outside looking in at the Puritans called them Puritans. Okay. So that's a key difference there. So the Mayflower Compact agreed they're going to create a government, self-government. Okay. And this is part of it. You don't have to read this unless you want to. Okay. So this is where they settled. And then the Puritans are going to come and settle Massachusetts Bay. They're eventually going to, as they expand, go down into on the Connecticut River. And then when some get kicked out, they move to Rhode Island. Okay, so let's look at the Massachusetts Bay Colony led by this guy, John Winthrop, and that is a crazy outfit right there. The Exodus began in 1630 with the departure of 900 Puritans led by John Winthrop. They almost had 1,000. A well-educated country squire who became the first governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England, hence the Puritans, but they were also called Congregationalists. That's what they referred to themselves. Winthrop said the settlers must be a city upon a hill and a shining light example to the world. Like the Pilgrims, the Puritans envisioned a reformed Christian society, a genuine New England that would inspire religious change in England and throughout Europe. Winthrop and his associates established the government of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the town of Boston. Okay, so Boston was founded by Puritans. They transformed their joint stock corporation. So the Pilgrims didn't really have a royal charter and just kind of settled there. The Puritans actually had a official joint stock corporation. So Puritans do really well financially, without question. They also appointed a governor who was John Winthrop. They also had a council and an assembly, and so they did have representative government. It was very democratic among the Puritans. Now, did they have women that voted? No, but nowhere else in the world do women vote either. And so they, to ensure rule by the godly, the Puritan limited the right to vote and hold office to men who were church members. So you could not be a member of the council or vote if you were not a church member. We'll talk about how that's going to change over time. Ignoring the policy of religious tolerance in Plymouth Colony, they established Puritanism as a state-supported religion. It's a theocracy. They barred other faiths from conducting services and used the Bible as a legal guide. They also kind of persecuted the Quakers when some of them came, and many of them go to Pennsylvania. Over the next decade, about 10,000 Puritans migrated to the colony, along with the 10,000 other fleeing hard times in England, like the Quakers. And they followed the teachings of John Calvin. The Puritans embraced predestination, the doctrine that God had chosen before their birth only a few elect men and women, the saints, for salvation. And they stressed a conversion experience. So you can see right here, the Puritans don't just go to New England. Some of them also, about 5,000 went to the Chesapeake, but 20,000 or so went to the Caribbean and Bermuda for sugar plantations. Okay, you can see right here, this is where they kind of, where in England they were coming from. So they weren't coming from this region or far northern Scotland. They were coming from these parts. So they eventually settled up into New Hampshire, which was one of the original 13 colonies. Maine was actually part of Massachusetts until it later becomes a state in 1825. And so 1, 2, 3, 4. Now this would have been a fifth one, but they eventually the English king makes Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth join together. Okay, so that's New England colonies. Okay. So good thing is about New England, they have good harbors. Boston's got a great port among Newport, Rhode Island, New London, Connecticut. New Haven is also a good one. Portland, Maine has got a great harbor. They had small farms, so not these big plantations like that's going to develop in the Chesapeake and also New York. Trade, and more trade is going to make New England very prosperous. It is rather hilly, forested, and they have shallow soil, so that's short growing seasons. Not conducive for cash crops, but conducive to grain and corn and other food crops. So don't get me wrong, they still farmed. Okay, there's still farms in New England, just not cash crop farms. Okay, Boston had about 15,000 by the 7 Years' War. Okay, they also had fishing. They also had lumber and fur trapping. Okay, all right. So, like I said, they sought to be a shining light example, city upon a hill, wanted to purify the Church of England, refer to them as Congregationalists, but outside referred to them as Puritans. You had to be a member of the church to vote. Okay, they did have a governor, a councilor, and an assembly, so it's very much a representative government, but it's more of a theocracy. Okay, they believed in predestination. Okay, so William Bradford was the founder of Plymouth Rock. John Winthrop is the founder of Massachusetts Bay. Okay, so religious freedom for both of them. Mayflower Compact for the Pilgrims. Puritans established a theocracy. Rhode Island was founded because Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson get banished by the Puritans for disagreeing with them. And they established religious freedom. It is a truly religious free colony. And it is a self-governing by the consent of the governor. Connecticut was just an overflow of Puritans there. New Hampshire, same thing. Okay. So they did give freemen the right to vote, even if you didn't own property, as long as you were a member of the church. Now, you're thinking, well, geez, you had to be a member of the church to vote. Well, the fact that they allowed non-property owning men to vote was pretty incredible for the rest of the world that didn't allow that. Okay. We'll see that the United States is one of the first places in world history that grants non-property owning men to right to vote. First of all, even having the right to vote was revolutionary. Okay. So, but in town government, all property owning males can vote at town meetings. So it's direct democracy, self-government. Okay. They're very moral and have had very prominent religious leaders such as John Cotton and John Winthrop. A lot of Johns there. My first name is John, but I'm not Puritans. And so the clergy was barred from formal political office. So the minister, that way you have a little bit of separation of church and state, but still a theocracy. And very much Protestant work ethic. I can't understate the Puritans' Protestant work ethic is one of the last legacies of American history. They didn't seek out a lot of pleasure, where you see some immigrants, particularly the Welsh and Scotch Irish, who liked a lot of leisure time in the South, and you'll see that develops kind of more of a uniquely Southern culture in American history, but very much taught the fear of hell and want to get the elect into heaven. Okay. So democracy, very democratic, with the exception of the theocracy side of it. So that's a lasting legacy in American history. So the Puritans do get a bad rap in some areas for the people remember the same witch trials, but you can't forget their good contributions in American history. Okay, they're people. They're going to make mistakes. They also argued against slavery. There was very, very little slavery in the New England colonies, and they were mostly in the cities. And if there was any slaves that worked for somebody that didn't own very many. Okay, and also New England's later going to lead the reform movements from the Second Great Awakening that we'll cover later in this course. Okay, big on education, big on a community feel, which I love in American history. I love the aspect of community. I think that's one thing that we can't lose sight of as American citizens, is a sense of community and taking care of each other, and when others are in need. And now, what ends up happening is the Puritans created a halfway covenant within about 30 years. As the first generation gets older and the second generation is coming up, they didn't share as much of the religious zeal as their parents and grandparents. So they made it where instead of participating in the Lord's Supper each Sunday and getting baptized to be a church member, now you just have to be baptized once and you can be a church member. So they made it where you only have to do half of the things, hence halfway covenant. Okay. All right, we'll talk about the Salem witch trials a little bit later. Now let's look at what the dissenters, Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams. Now, to maintain God's favor, the Puritan magistrates of Massachusetts Bay purged their society of religious dissidents. Roger Williams, who served as a minister of the Puritan Church in Salem, which later had the Salem witch trials, probably wouldn't have had it if Roger Williams would have still been there. Williams endorsed the Pilgrim separation of church and state in Plymouth and condemned the legal establishment of Congregationalism in Massachusetts Bay. He taught that ministers did not have control over people's spiritual lives, but only their bodies, goods, and outwards estates of men. So he'd be like, you should be responsible for yourself. Moreover, Williams questioned the Puritan seizure of Indian lands. Now, this is one thing Roger Williams gets praised for in U.S. history, is that he was like, look, it's wrong to take Native Americans' land. We should, if we're gonna get it from them, then we should pay them and give them a just trade for their land as a normal business transaction. Now, the magistrates banished him from the colony in 1636, really because he challenged their authority. And Williams and his father settled about 50 miles south of Boston, founding the town of Providence, Rhode Island, on land purchased from the Narragansett Indians. So they did move on Indian land, but they bought it. Okay, that's pretty fair. Other religious dissidents settled nearby at Portsmouth and Newport. And in 1644, the settlers obtained a corporate charter from Parliament for a new colony called Rhode Island. So they got their own independence, basically, with full authority to rule themselves. In Rhode Island, they practiced separation of church and state as well as religious freedom. Now, Anne Hutchinson, who's probably just as well known, if not more well known, just because she was a woman who spoke out, she led weekly prayer meetings for women in her home and accused various Boston clergymen of placing too much emphasis on good behavior. She's like, look, you're saved by God's grace. She insisted that there was no covenant of works, that God bestowed salvation through the covenant of grace. Moreover, Anne Hutchinson declared that God revealed divine truth directly to the individual believer, a doctrine the Puritan magistrates denounced as heretical. A lot of Puritans Protestants have this view that you can know divine truth through what Christians call the Holy Spirit, but Puritans kind of questioned that. They thought it came from the minister, and that God revealed stuff to them, and so that they're challenging the minister's authority, and therefore they're going to kick her out. She also believed that both men and women could be saved, but that women were inferior to men in earthly. Puritans believed that both men and women could be saved, but were inferior to men in earthly affairs. They likewise denied women significant roles within the church. Puritan women could not be ministers or lay preachers, and they had no vote in the congregation. Now, in 1637, the year after Roger Williams kicked out, Anne Hutchinson went on trial for teaching inward grace freed an individual from the rules of the church. Even though she defended herself quite well, Winthrop even admitted this privately. She was found guilty of holding heretical views. Banished, she and her husband and children followed Roger Williams in Exxon, Rhode Island. Unfortunately, she was eventually killed by the Narragansett Indians. And which is really gut-wrenching is at one point when she had a miscarriage, one of the Puritans said that, oh, that's God's judgment upon her. Man, she just lost a child. Roger Williams, man, the myth, the legend. He actually started the first Baptist church in the United States. So New England spreads to Connecticut. Also, they create the first, what I think is the first true constitution. Some people say it's the Mayflower Compact, whatever. But it's the first constitution for a colonial government. You could argue in American history. New Hampshire is expanded, and what ends up happening is eventually England's going to assert greater control over New England, which we're going to get to later. Now, what happens back home? And back home in England. In 1642, over religious matters, the Scottish Presbyterian Army invaded England. Thousands of English Puritans and hundreds of American Puritans joined the invaders, demanding reform of the established church and greater authority over Parliament. After several years of civil war, the parliamentary forces led by Oliver Cromwell were victorious. In 1649, Parliament executed King Charles I, proclaimed a Republican Commonwealth, and banished bishops and elaborate rituals from the Church of England. In 1653, when Cromwell died, moderate Protestants and a resurgent aristocracy restored the monarchy and the hierarchy of bishops. This defeat for the Puritans caused the Puritan ministers in America to exhort their congregations to create a holy society in America. All right, now, one of the most infamous scenes in American history, the Salem witch trials. So, really, it's really a tragic event because it really is motivated by economic jealousy. So, one thing you'll notice, and there was I used to show students a primary source document, and it showed a map of the town. And all the people that were accused lived on one side of town that had the larger plots. Those that were accusing those of witchcraft were on the other side of town on the smaller plots. So it was like the poorer people were accusing the richer people, or the rich people. So it started with basically these teenage girls and so forth. But you got to kind of understand the context. So, like Native Americans, Puritans believed the physical world was full of supernatural forces. Devout Christians saw signs of God's or Satan's power in blazing stars, birth defects, and other unusual events, such as a miscarriage by Anne Hutchinson or something. Puritans also believed in witchcraft. Didn't mean they practiced it; they just believed that it was prominent. There was actually witchcraft in world history. In fact, there's this rising Wicca religion actually in the U.S. right now. Between 1647 and 1662, civil authorities in New England hanged 14 people for witchcraft, mostly older women accusing of being double-tongued or of having an unruly spirit. Okay, so it started by two young girls, Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams, who probably should have been imprisoned themselves. And so if you were accused of consorting with the devil, you had committed a crime against the government, basically. And so if you could prove it, the punishment was hanging. And so what ends up happening is their disapproval of the local reverend. Land disputes is really the big one. And they also claimed also an Indian had taught witchcraft to the girls. So the girls kind of like acting out, dancing, throwing fits, accusing people of bewitching them, which is like putting them under their power and so forth. And several women get accused, including one man. 19 are hung. 19. Okay. And one was pressed. That means they like crushed him. So 20 people were killed for this nonsense. 50 confessed as witches because if you put enough pressure on somebody, eventually somebody's going to cave in and confess to something. 150 went to trial. Okay. So what ends up happening is eventually the governor's wife gets accused of witchcraft. He's like, all right, we're in this nonsense. He pardons everybody that was still in prison and ends the thing, which should have happened at the beginning. Okay. And later people admitted that they messed up by doing this. They had a lot of guilt. I'm sure the girls did too. It really is terrible what ends up happening there, but it is kind of a fascinating event. My wife has toured Salem and got to tour. I'm going to hopefully go see it at some point. Anyway, probably plan on taking my dad to Boston to see a Red Sox game. We might go tour it this summer. So really, a lot of people claim that historians claim that it was this changing society around them, and they had trouble explaining it, and they're blaming it on witchcraft and so forth. That's what a lot of historians say. I've already covered the halfway covenant, but it reduces the requirements for church membership. So instead of just taking the Lord's Supper or communion every Sunday, now you just have to be baptized instead of doing both. Okay, that was showing that the Puritans' kind of hold on the society is declining. Okay, so the Great Migration in the 1600s is actually Puritans coming over. Not later in U.S. history too, we talk about the Great Migration of African Americans leaving the South and moving to the Midwest and Northeast in large numbers after World War I and World War II. So you can see the population of England colonies shooting up. Okay, population of Native Americans, populations of blacks very, very low. Okay, so you see the Chesapeake growth. A little bit. That's not New Jersey's not really part of the Chesapeake, and then you see in New England, and of course the middle colonies are going to grow in New York and New Jersey. All right, so New England had a greater population because they migrated families and were just out breeding everybody. And the Chesapeake had a good amount as well. Okay, this is a Puritan alphabet. So let's look at what a yeoman is. A yeoman is a farmer who doesn't work for somebody. They own their own land, but they're not like they don't own slaves. They just work for themselves. So you work instead of working for the man, you're working for yourself. In building their communities, New England Puritans consciously rejected the feudal practices of traditional European society. Land was distributed by proprietors to male heads of the families. Widespread ownership of land did not mean equality of wealth or status, but town proprietors normally awarded the largest plots to men of high social status who often became select men and justices of the peace. However, all families received some land, which is good. Nowhere else in the world could you really have that. And most adult men had a vote in the town meeting. And the main institution of local government was the town meeting. So town meeting is the local institution of government. In comparison, ordinary farmers had much more political power than Chesapeake yeomen and European peasants did. These farmers could vote to levy taxes, enact ordinances, and regulate the use of common fields, manage town affairs, and select the town's representatives to the general court, which gradually displaced the government as the center of political authority. Since the soil was very rocky, they participated in mostly subsistence farming. That means farming to feed themselves, but they did have some crops to take to the market. Fishing, timber, and shipbuilding became bigger enterprise in New England. And like I said, Puritan women had on average 8 to 10 pregnancies and had as many as 8 surviving children. So they were healthier. They had a higher life expectancy. All right, last topic we're going to talk about is the Native American conflict in New England because it is nasty. All right, you have 2 conflicts, Pequot War and then King Philip's War. So in the Chesapeake, you had the first Powhatan War and the second Powhatan Confederation War. So that's one similarity. So according to Native Americans, Europeans invaded their lands, which they did. They introduced daily diseases and erected hundreds of permanent settlements. Some Indian peoples, among them the Pequots in England and the Susquehannocks in Virginia, resisted the invaders by force. Others, mostly prominent, the Iroquois, used European guns and manufacturers to dominate other tribes. So other native peoples retreated to the mountains or moved west to preserve their traditional cultures, like you see the Hurons doing when they became the Wyandot tribe. So let's look at the Pequot War first. Okay, the Puritans really kind of didn't treat the Native Americans very well. Now, the Pilgrims, when they first came, were recruited by the Indians to actually help fight a rival tribe. In the Pequot War, the Narragansetts joined forces with the Puritans to fight against their arch rival, the Pequots. So the Pequots are here in the village in the middle, and then the Narragansetts are out here on the outside, and then the Puritans are right here. Okay, so it was actually a combined Puritan and Narragansett force. And so the Puritans, like a lot of Europeans, saw them as savages and culturally inferior peoples. Not everybody did, but many did. They did not believe, though, that they were genetically inferior to them, like true racism. They were just prejudiced toward them. They believed they needed God and conversion. Some, like John Eliot, tried to convert them to Christianity by translating the Bible into their Algonquian language. And you actually have Christian missionaries that go out. There were even Puritans who went out and adopted Native American lifestyle. And because the Puritans demanded that Indians understand the complexities of Protestant theology, only a few Native Americans became full members of the Puritan congregations. The Puritans created praying towns that were similar to the Franciscan missions in New Mexico. So if you were a believer of Congregationalist Christianity, then you would just kind of live in this praying town. By 1670, more than 1,000 Indians lived in 14 special towns. Even the coastal Indians who remained in their ancestral village had lost much of their independence and traditional culture. Okay. So anyway, the massacre at Mystic Village is kind of what the Pequot War is about. The Puritans and the Narragansetts slaughtered the Pequots. They killed about 500 men, women, and children. Pretty terrible. And it's retaliation because they had attacked English farmers on the Connecticut River. And so it's so like you attacked us, so we're going to attack you. Okay. And it's this population growth that leads to this nasty conflict. Actually, statistically speaking, King Philip's War is the most violent war in American history. Now, does that mean overall loss of life? No, but what it means overall percentage of the population's loss of life. It was bad. And the Native Americans almost won it. If they had won it, American history might have turned out differently. By the 1670s, there were 3 times as many whites as Indians living in New England. The English population now totaled some 55,000, while the number of native peoples had plummeted from an estimated 120,000 in 1570 to 70,000 in 1620 to barely 16,000. When Metacom, the leader of the Wampanoags, now the English called him King Philip, his tribe killed some pigs who wandered onto their land, the English claimed property damage. Metacom was like, no, we're not going to pay you for that. He concluded that only military resistance could save Indian lands and culture. And so what he did is Metacom got a confederation of the remaining tribes to fight together. Now, one of the things you'll see throughout U.S. history is when Native Americans tend to unite, they tend to put a beat down on the Europeans or the Americans. This particular war they lost, but they did put some severe beat downs on them. Okay, and so Metacom knows King Philip, the English is going to attack several white settlements after he creates a alliance with the Narragansetts and the Nipmucks. Bitter fighting continued in 1676, ending only when the Indian warriors ran short of guns and powder, and the Massachusetts Bay government hired Mohegan and Mohawk warriors who ambushed and killed Metacom. So really, the Puritans couldn't beat Metacom. They had to hire the Mohawks from the Iroquois tribe and the Mohican tribe, which is kind of on the far west side of Massachusetts into New York State. The fighting was long and hard. Indians destroyed 20% of the English towns in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and killed about 1,000 settlers, nearly 5% of the adult population. Had the Indians not been divided, they probably would have forced the Puritans to stay further east or even leave. So if the Mohicans and the Mohawks would have fought with them, the Indians would have won. The natives' own losses from famine, disease, death, and battle, and sell into slavery were much larger. About 4,500 Indians died, a quarter of an already diminished population. Many of the surviving Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Nipmuc peoples migrated further into the New England backcountry, where they intermarried with Algonquin tribes allied to the French. So basically assimilated to other tribes. It's pretty sad in American history. Okay. Last topic, and then we're done with this topic, As English towns slowly filled the river valleys along the Atlantic coast, the Indians who live in the great forest areas beyond the Appalachians mountains remained independent, and they participated in the fur trade. They traded a lot with Europeans for tools, metal items, clothing, shoes. In exchange, they would give the Europeans furs, and that's where the term "a buck for a dollar" came from. It was a buckskin was equivalent to a dollar. Um, they also dealt with the Dutch and the English, and not just the French. Um, and still, because the Indians had no way of knowing the value of their pelts in Europe, they rarely secured the highest possible price. So they kind of didn't always get the best prices. All Indian peoples were diminished in number and vitality as they encountered European diseases. So this is an unintended consequence, but one that happens. Also, they encountered European guns and European rum, which led to really high rates of alcoholism. Most native societies also lost their economic independence, and as they exchanged furs for European-made iron utensils and woolen blankets, Indians neglected their traditional arts and skills, making fewer flint hoes, clay pots, and skin garments. You know why? Because the European stuff they thought was better and easier. Um, Religious autonomy vanished as well. When French missionaries won converts among the Hurons, Iroquois, and the Illinois tribe, they divided Indian communities into hostile religious factions. Likewise, constant warfare for furs, like the Beaver Wars, altered the dynamics of tribal politics by shifting power from cautious elders to headstrong young warriors. The disruption of farming by warfare and the influx of European goods undermined the economic basis of women's power, because some of these tribes were matrilineal. Some groups, like the Iroquois, saw women's power and roles increase from European influence as they were in charge of assimilating the captives. There is no doubt that the sheer extent of the fur industry, the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of beaver, deer, otter, and other animals profoundly altered the environment. Also, a lot of trees got cut down. A lot of settlers' accounts when they first came, and they talk about the forests were so thick, sun didn't even touch the bottom of the land, like you see in the Amazon rainforest. As animal populations died off, streams ran faster since there were fewer beaver dams, and the underbrush grew denser, and there were fewer deer to trim the vegetation. And that's it.